Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Eddie Jennings from EJSLLC.com, and this is the next in the series of getting started with Hyper-V from the ground up. In the last video we talked about configuring the Hyper-V host and a client machine to be able to connect with HyperV Manager to be able to create and manage VMs. And we did that in a non-domain environment. There were a couple extra steps that we had to do in order to be able to authenticate to the Hyper-V host to be able to manage it. In this video we're going to be doing the same steps, or mostly the same steps. I'll try to go in the same order if possible, except we're doing it from a domain environment, so there actually will be a few fewer steps that need to happen to be able to connect Hyper-V Manager from the client to the host. So here I am with our Hyper-V host. I've done a fresh install, and I'm going to send it Control-Alt-Delete, put in the administrator credentials, and sconfig will come up, or the server configuration. Remember, if this does not come up immediately for you, you can type sconfig in the command prompt window and that will bring it up. Now, the first thing we're going to work with is changing the host name of the computer. You can do this at the same time of joining it to a domain, but there are a couple of other configurations that we want to do prior to joining this to the domain. So I'm just going to start with the computer name for right now. So to do that, we'll choose option 2, and we're going to enter a new computer name. We're going to call this Hyper-V host. Oh, I got a sticky key with my console here. And it's going to say we have to reboot to apply the changes. This is a thing in the Windows world, not so in the Linux world. So if you're coming from the Linux world and you're thinking, why am I having to reboot? Just know this is how it is in the Windows world when you change host names. So we'll say yes. And I'm not going to sit through the entire boot cycle because you've already seen that in a previous video. But one thing I do want to note, I'll mainly be using sconfig as well as PowerShell to do the configurations on the Hyper-V host. There are multiple ways of doing the same thing, so if you would rather use other tools, by all means use it. But for these videos, I'll be sticking with sconfig and Hyper-V. So in just a moment, the server will be back up and we'll continue with configuration. Alright, and we're back. So I'm going to do my Control-Alt-Delete macro to be able to sign in. And this will bring up the sconfig configuration. And you'll see that the computer name has changed to Hyper-V host. Now the next thing I'm going to configure is remote desktop. I'm going to use option 7 for this. You might be wondering why I'm configuring remote desktop, because this is a non-GUI system. Well, even though it's non-GUI, there are some GUI elements in it, and when you RDP to Windows Server that doesn't have a GUI, you are met with this command prompt, and you can launch sconfig and such. So it's kind of like being able to have a console session over RDP, which I have found useful with administration and such. You don't have to do this, but it's an option I'm going to go ahead and show you how to do. So we chose the option 7, and you're asked to enable or disable remote desktop. We're going to enable it, letter E, and then we'll be asked about 2 different ways of doing authentication, and we want to use option 1, network level authentication. And that's going to make some changes to the Windows firewall to allow for RDP. And you'll get a little warning about network level authentication. We're going to say OK to that. Next, we're going to configure network settings. So to do that, I'm going to use option 8. And when we do this, we're going to be presented with whatever active interfaces there are. There's actually 2, or technically 3 NICs if you count the iDRAC NIC that I'm using for my console session on this server. However, only 1 is actually being active. Windows doesn't recognize the iDRAC NIC because it's operating on a level below the operating system. So in order to change your NIC, we're going to use the interface number. I am using a DHCP reservation. I find that for my lab that's a little bit easier to manage addresses that I want to be static, but in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to configure the static address, simply because that's probably what you're going to be encountering most often in your work environment. So I'll choose option or index 2. Sometimes the index number can look strange. I've seen systems where there's 2 NICs and they're index 15 and 16. I'm not quite sure why that is the way that is, but just know that it could happen, so don't be concerned if it is. Now this already has IP settings, but I'm going to configure the static settings to be the same, so that way I know there's no potential for conflict. I also had a hard time finding the word I want to use. There's no potential for address conflict on the network. So I'm going to choose set network adapter address. That's option 1. I'm going to put in first we have to say DHCP or static, so we'll do static. I'm going to put in 192.168.199. And this is a 24-bit subnet that I'm using for this network, so the 255.255.255.0 subnet mask is fine, so we'll keep that. And the default gateway is 192.168.1.1. Now for DNS server, I'm actually going to set that to what my domain controller is in my lab here, because we'll need that. We'll need to be able to resolve the domain name that we're using for domain joining this host. So I'm going to choose option 2 for set DNS server. And in a preferred DNS server, that's going to be 192.168.1.148. And we'll say preferred DNS server set. I'm not going to use an alternate DNS server. I have only one domain controller in this lab environment. And so now you'll see that IP address and subnet hasn't changed, but you'll see that DHCP is now false, and the preferred DNS server changed to what was being pushed by DHCP, which is my general internet accessible home lab, to the domain controller. Next, we'll choose option 4, return to the main menu. Next, we're going to work with date and time. So I'm going to choose option 9. And this is one of those strange instances where even though we're in a non-GUI environment, supposedly, there is a GUI element here. And I'm going to use my mouse to do this. You can do this via the keyboard using tab, but just for ease, I'll use my mouse. Now, if you're in the Pacific time zone, don't change this. However, I'm in the Eastern time zone, and when you get ISOs from Microsoft, they typically, by default, have Pacific time configured. And so I want to keep everything in the same time zone, so I'm going to configure this to Eastern time. If you want to, you can configure internet time, which is your NTP setting. I'm not going to configure this because once we domain join it, it's going to be getting this from the domain controller anyway. But if you wanted to configure something other than time.windows.com, I often use the ntp.org pools, or sometimes I'll use the NTP servers from nist.gov. So we'll click OK. That's going to set our time. Now, the next thing that we want to configure is the disk. Because if you recall, in the initial configuration of this server, we did a partition for about 50 gigabytes for just the hypervisor, and we're going to put everything else onto another partition on the same disk. So to do that, we're going to actually exit sconfig and exit to the command line, so that's option 14. And at the command line, I like to use PowerShell whenever I can. So this is just a command.exe command line. To get into PowerShell, you'll need to actually type PowerShell. And in just a moment, the prompt is going to change, and you're going to see a PS in front of it, which indicates that we are at a PowerShell prompt. And first I'm going to do get disk. And what's going to be returned are going to be 2 physical disks. One of which is the RAID 10 array, and that RAID 10 is taking the 4 disks and presenting them as one disk to the operating system, and the other is the USB stick that we used for installing HyperV server. I'm also going to do get volume, and there's that sticky key for my console again. And these are the volumes that have been configured on the disk, and 2 of them are mounted and have drive letters with it, C and D. So what we're going to do now is create a partition on the disk that is currently holding the operating system, which is disk number 0. So I'm going to do new partition. Tab complete there. For some reason I tend to misspell partition, so I'll do my tab complete just to make sure I spelled it right. And we're going to use disk number 0. We're going to just use all of the space. We're not going to partition this any further, so use maximum size. There goes the sticky key. And we're going to go ahead and give it a drive letter. If we tried to do D, it's going to give us an error saying this is already in use, so we're going to use drive letter E. And that is everything that we want. So this creates our partition. Now what we need to do is format a volume on this partition. So to do that, we're going to use format volume. The drive letter, the mount point that we're using, drive letter E. File system, we're going to go ahead and use NTFS. And new file system label, I was thinking it was assigned file system label. New file system label, this isn't going to have really an effect on anything, but just kind of makes it look nice when you do get volume. So we're going to call it data. And it'll take just a moment, and it's going to format this volume. So now if we do get volume, you'll see that we have C, D, and E. And E is about 3.5 terabytes, because that is, once we do formatting and such, that's the space that we have available to it. Now, I'm going to go ahead and make a couple of directories here. So I'm going to change directory CD, or I could do the PowerShell way, which would be set location. And that sticky key a good bit. Not local group. Set location path E. CD from the Linux world for change directory will work. You can also use mkdir or makedir to do this, but trying to stick to the PowerShell way of doing it for the demonstration here. So we're going to do new item, and the path, we're already in E, so we're just going to put the folder name. First is going to be VMs, and type is directory with only one D. I'm going to press the up arrow and simply change the path to the next folder name that I want. So this will be VHDs type directory. And we're going to make one more for ISOs. These will be our disk images. So now if I do get child item, or ls if you're from the Linux world, you'll see that we have 3 directories here. So at this point, our Hyper-V host is mostly configured. Now we want to join it to the domain. So we can do this from PowerShell, but I want to go back to sconfig to do this. I'm going to exit my PowerShell session. This little sticky key is getting a bit annoying. So we're now back in command.exe. You'll see that the PS has vanished, and we're going to use sconfig, which you could launch sconfig from the PowerShell prompt as well if you wanted to. And so now we are going to choose option 1. It's going to ask us if we want to join a domain or a work group. We're going to choose domain, and the domain that we're joining for this example is going to be ejslab.com. It's going to ask for an authorized domain user. I've went ahead and created an account in the domain administrators group to use. So I'm going to do ejslab and my administrator account, Eddie admin. It's going to ask for the password. It's not going to show any cursors, so don't be concerned if you don't see any stars, as this is normal. And at this point it's going to ask if you want to change the computer name. We've already done that, but if you wanted to do it all in one operation, you can do it here. So we're going to choose no. And then it says that you have to restart the computer to apply the changes. This is perfectly normal, and we will say yes. And just like before, I'm going to let this reboot, and then we will return to the video, do one more configuration, and then head over to the client machine. Alright, and we're back on the login screen. So we're going to do Control-Alt-Delete, and notice it says enter credentials for administrator or hit escape to switch users or sign-in methods. We're going to press the escape key, and it says select sign-in option for administrator or hit escape to switch users. We're going to switch users, and I'm going to press down to choose other user. I'm going to sign in as my domain administrator account. See if I fat fingered that. I don't think that I did. Now there really won't be much special to this. It'll simply bring me into the command prompt. Sometimes it'll open sconfig for us, and it looks like it's going to this time. Alright. Last thing we want to do on this is configure remote management. What I mean by this is we're going to enable ping. You do not have to do this. It's not required. I tend to like having ping enabled, but it's not necessary. So if you're in an environment where you follow the philosophy of do not allow any unnecessary traffic to and from your server, that is a valid thing to follow, and ping would often would fall under that. But I think most environments you're going to be in will allow you to be able to ping servers. So we'll choose option 3, and it's going to ask if we want to allow remote machines to ping the server. We're going to say yes. And successfully configured to allow ping. We're going to return to the main menu. Exit to the command line, and I want to make sure we can ping our domain controller. So test DC, and that should resolve the fully qualified domain, and we can ping the domain controller. Now I'm curious to see if we can ping our test client. I think we should be able to. At the very least, it will resolve the domain name. So we may not be able to ping it, but we know that it's going to resolve the domain name. The test client is a fresh VM, and it might not have ping enabled on it. So at this point, we have finished configuration for the HyperV host. We're going to move over to the client and get it configured to where we'll be able to manage our host remotely with HyperV Manager. We'll be right back. Alright, so we're back. I have our client machine here. This is a freshly domain joined machine to my little lab here. And I've logged in as my non-domain administrator account, mainly because in your environment you'll probably be doing the same thing. Usually you don't log in as your administrator account to do your day-to-day functions. You log in as a non-privileged account, and then when needed you'll elevate sessions with a privileged account. So one thing you'll notice is the time difference here with this part of the video versus the last part. There are a couple of things I had to test on the fly. I've touted that it's a little bit easier to work with this environment with domain joined machines, and it is from a configuration perspective. There's fewer things we need to do. But I did run into one issue that I don't recall running into before, but that's probably because I was in an environment where the pieces that caused problems were already set via group policy, so I had simply forgotten about it. But I'll show that to you, but I'll also we'll show you a method that will allow things to work nicely for you. So on our freshly domain joined machine, first thing I want to show you is that we can ping our HyperV host, and the ping is not the most important aspect of this as we wait for PowerShell to load, but it's the fact that it's going to resolve the host name. So we'll do ping HyperV host and press enter, and you notice that the fully qualified domain name is resolving. If you recall, in the non-domain environment, at this point we would have to alter the host file to be able to resolve the name. So the next thing we need to do is actually install the HyperV tools, and to do that we're going to go into the control panel. Probably the easiest way to find the control panel in Windows 10 is by going to the search feature and start typing the word control. And we'll see control panel come up. And where we're going to want to go is programs and features. Now by default, control panel shows stuff by category. I usually change this to either large or small icons. We'll go to programs and features. We're going to turn a Windows feature on. This is going to require administrator credentials, so I'm going to use my domain administrator account. And the feature that we're turning on is are the HyperV management tools. So if you click the plus sign beside HyperV and click HyperV management tools, that's what we need. If you want, you can click the plus sign and see what all we're installing, and it's two pieces. It's the GUI HyperV Manager as well as the modules for managing items via PowerShell. You'll notice that HyperV platform is grayed out, and that's because the virtual processor that this VM is running on does not support virtualization itself, so you can't run a hypervisor on it. And on that note, you might be wondering, how am I already using a VM when I'm configuring? I have not finished, configuring VMs on a HyperV host. And that's because on the computer that I'm using for this demonstration, it also is a hypervisor, and I'm running a VM to connect to our newly configured hypervisor. So we'll click OK. That's going to search for required files and do the installation. One thing to note, in the non-domain environment, we had to reboot after the installation, and after doing several tests here in the domain environment, we have not had to reboot, which I find kind of odd. But this is probably true somewhat in the Linux administration world as well, but as I have definitely experienced in the Windows administration world, truth can be stranger than fiction sometimes. So in just a moment, this will complete and the HyperV management tools will be installed. This is also taking longer than what I had in some of my tests, and of course the famous last words in IT are things such as should and took long, or was different than what our test environment was. Alright, so it's completed the changes, and you can find these if you click Start and you begin to scroll down. Within the Windows Administrative Tools, you will find HyperV Manager. Now, this is where I ran into a couple of issues. So first, I'm going to show you what to do to be able to make this function the way that we want. And what we're going to do is right-click HyperV Manager, and we're going to run as administrator. We're going to go ahead and run the entire session elevated. And so we'll have to put in our domain administrator credentials. Click yes. This is going to open HyperV Manager, but we're going to already be in an elevated session. So to connect to our HyperV host, we're going to do connect to server. I usually use the fully qualified domain name for this, so HyperV, if I spell that correctly, host.ejslab.com. Now we're not going to connect as a different user simply because the whole session here is running as the domain administrator account. So when we click OK, we now have our HyperV host, and it has hypervhost.ejslab.com. And so at this point, if we wanted to, we can go into HyperV settings, start configuring items and such. The last video in the series will be the finishing of this configuration. But at this point, you're set. You're ready to manage your HyperV host in the domain environment. And if you recall from the non-domain video, we have not had to make any alterations to WSMan, nor have we had to deal with CredSSP. which something I want to show you real quick. That is where I was running into the problems in the domain environment, and I was a little surprised that this was even a thing. What I'm going to do is close HyperV Manager, and I'm going to run the HyperV Manager not in an elevated session, but simply run HyperV Manager. And if I do this, notice that the HyperV server is not there anymore. That's because this is running as a different user effectively. You're running as your actual logged in user. So if I do connect to HyperV server, put in the fully qualified domain name, and then this time we're going to need to connect as another user. I know for a fact the Eddie user account, which is the account that I'm on, my non-domain admin account, is not an administrator on the HyperV server, and so as a result it's not going to be able to connect or do any kind of management. So we would click connect as another user, and to set the user you can use user principal name or the traditional domain / username. That's what we're going to use here. JS Lab Eddie admin. Go ahead and click remember me. Now, something that we're going to see once we click OK and then click OK to connect is it's going to complain about cred SSP. Or actually, it's going to first talk about delegation of credentials, which if you recall in the non-domain video, that's something that we had to configure within the local group policy. If I click yes, it will then complain about cred SSP. And this is what surprised me, because in a domain environment, not to get too deep into authentication, I would expect this to always be using Kerberos. So at some point when I have some time, I'll research this and try to figure out why the session has to be elevated as the administrator, or whatever the account is that you're using to connect to your Hyper-V host, why that had to be versus simply passing the credential in this fashion. But either way, if you simply run the HyperV Manager as administrator, that actually will save you the step of needing to enter the credentials to connect, because the whole session will be as your domain administrator account. So at this point, between the previous video and the video now, we have successfully configured both the Hyper-V host and our client machine to be able to communicate to one another. The client machine using Hyper-V Manager to be able to do any type of configuration or VM management. The next video, which will be the final video in this series, is from that Hyper-V Manager creating our first VM and getting the ISO files onto the Hyper-V host to be able to use them to install operating systems. So thank you for taking the time to watch. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in with the video, and make sure that you click like on this video and subscribe to the channel so you can be aware of when new content comes out. Thanks again for your time, and I will see you the next time.